Um, I'm very comfortable in my relationship with this person. I'm not really worried about how I can provide more care to him.
Okay.
What I do worry more about is over the next 18 months when I talk to somebody who has completely different thoughts from him or me on this. Like in that meeting I was at on Saturday, one guy next to me said, "I can tell you what, Jesus wouldn't be married to no gay guys." I was like, oh, okay. I don't know that Jesus performed weddings. But he said it with a lot of anger about the whole thing, yeah.
Yeah.
And that whole conversation's going to come up, and I'm going to be like, well, I don't know.
So what are your ideas with what you've... following your principle. What are your ideas?
I suppose I need to have a definition of when it is so far that I need to step in.
Okay.
And so that's a question I need to define better. When something does go so far that I need to step in.
Have you imagined what that looks like right now? I mean, what would that...
Yeah, at this point it would probably be when somebody said that those people aren't welcome in our church.
Okay.
And I'd tell them I'd rather accept them here than be accepted at a gay bar, because they're being accepted somewhere. Or something like that. And yeah, that's probably where I draw the line, is when somebody said that those people aren't welcome in our church.
Okay.
That's my answer.
Okay. Yeah. So somebody says that, so what would be the theological principle that you would hang your hat on for that encounter if it should arise?
I mean, the easiest thing to say probably would be Jesus didn't come to heal the people who weren't sick yet. That insinuates something that maybe I don't believe.
Mm-hmm.
That what they're doing is inherently wrong. However, we're all sinners, so everybody's needed to be in there. I don't think it's something they can argue with. It's not necessarily me standing up and giving them my theological viewpoint on nitpicking secondary items in our scripture, in my opinion. Maybe third tier.
So I'm curious, what do you think about sin? And yeah, what do you think about sin?
Capital S or lowercase s?
Both. How about that?
This is fun. It's like Board of Ordained Ministry all over again.
I'm not going to grade you on it.
Sin and evil sort of go together. Evil is what I believe is anything that goes against God's goodness.
Okay.
And sin is that force which I think makes us want to turn away from God's goodness. It's that sort of capital S. It's that cosmic force, the powers of wicked and evil, principalities, all that sort of stuff that Paul's talking about. That sort of bent towards sinning, as Charles Wesley calls it.
Mm-hmm.
And that one song, I can't remember its name right now. God of Grace and God of Glory, that's it. When we actually partake in that, is when we move into sinning. And all of us are susceptible to it. And all of us do it at some point in time. I think a lot of people think that we have a lot more power over sin than we do. When if we actually had power over sin, we wouldn't really need Jesus. And so all of us end up falling into that trap and getting caught by it because, as I've told you before, we just suck. It all goes back to that theological principle for me.
Now, is that particularly Wesleyan?
Sure. I don't think it's not Wesleyan.
All right, I just, yeah, all right.
Actually, one of Wesley, one of his, I guess, his major theological achievement, I guess, is his explanation of grace, in the way he's able to explain grace. And one of the ways that we understand prevenient grace is through convincing grace. When we feel guilty, when we feel terrible about what we've done, that's actually God's grace working on us. When we understand we're terrible people, that is when grace is really doing its job, because then we can turn back towards God.
Okay.
So yeah, my recognition of my being a terrible person is what drives me towards God and towards perfection.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so, yeah.
Not necessarily created terrible, but we all become pretty tarnished pretty quickly without even meaning to.
Yeah. So, I mean, it certainly sounds to me...
Somebody in your group's going to disagree with that.
I don't care. That, I mean, it sounds like you have a pretty clear thought of what sin is, and that it is more or less a universal human experience, given that we're broken in our relationship with God.
That drives us away from God.
Drives us away from God. Yeah. Do you see that position that you have, that thought that you have, as being a resource for you in your conversation with others? Maybe not, spouting off the theology itself, but how it would ground a conversation?
I suppose it could. I don't know if my conversation over that sort of thing if I want it to be about, to get bogged down in whether this is a sin or not. Sin is a good area to talk about, but only in relation to the grace that God offers and the grace that is available here. And I've heard other pastors talk about all the other sins that we do, and I think that's sort of a partial answer to the whole question. Because still, once again, it assumes that just by the virtue of somebody being gay means that they're committing a sin. I'm uncomfortable. That's why I'm uncomfortable with that sort of rationality, even though I know all of us are sinners. I don't really like to get bogged down in what makes us sinners necessarily. Because I think that's sort of nitpicky. It sort of reminds me of when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees about all their tithing and like, you tithe mint and dill and cumin. And yeah, you should do that. That's important stuff. But it's not nearly as important as this stuff, the weightier matters of justice. And what does that justice look like? And how is justice... Are we going to argue about little nitpicky things about what sin is? Are we going to be more worried about kids who are starving one every few minutes in this world? Are we going to be worried about the people who don't have access to clean drinking water? Because I tell you what, we fix all those problems, and we can argue about gay people all day long if you want. Once we finish that.
Okay. Yeah. So using justice as your framework.
I feel like there's weightier matters, and I've sort of said that before. I've made mention. I can't believe people think the United Methodist Church needs to split, as we're looking at an UMCOR shower trailer for people at disaster relief sites to go into, is we're looking at churches that have completely closed down the church in order to rebuild it as a disaster relief site, and the actual church is meeting in another church for the time being so that groups can come in and actually do stuff. I'm like, this is the amazing thing our church does because it's together. Even though we disagree on some minor theological things, I'm not really worried about that. I see all the great stuff we're doing.
Mm-hmm.
We literally cut malaria in half over the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the Methodist Church is one of the major people working on that. And so I see all this great stuff that the church has done in the last decade or so. I'm like, why are we arguing about? What are we doing here, Harry? So yeah, that I have put it through that lens before.
Okay.
I would rather worship with people I don't agree with and get some really good stuff done for God than agree with them and sit in a dying church building, because that's what a lot of our churches are.
So, what would be an essential core belief for anybody coming to the Methodist Church? I mean, what is what is a central core belief that if you're Methodist, this is what you stand on?
Outside of casseroles. It's also Baptist, I hear.
We are too.
Yeah. Everybody thinks they have the casserole pegged. If I was going to say one core thing to my experience being Methodist, it would be that connectional nature that allows us to pursue justice in the world. The Methodist Church, it's the first church that ever had a social creed. We're the only church with a lobbying group on Capitol Hill. And our lobbying group doesn't fight for the Methodist Church. It only fights for issues that help literally everybody. And so we have, a lot of Methodists don't know it, but we have a large attachment to caring about justice issues. And it really goes back to the very beginning when Wesley and all his friends got together. They said justice was also a piety issue.
Mm-hmm.
Today, piety and justice somehow, in the Methodist Church too, have become separate.
Okay.
Piety means we're following all the rules, and justice means, to the people who really care about piety, that you're not really that worried about piety, you just want everybody to be happy. And people who think justice is really important think that people who care about piety don't care about justice. When I preach to people who care a lot about piety and they care a lot about justice, there's just some sort of disconnect.
Some fracture.
There's some sort of fracture that's happened where we're afraid to believe that both of those things are important. Which is terrible, because our church started, the reason that Wesley and all his friends were visiting the sick, that the reason they put together the Primitive Physic, which was a book for poor people about health, and how to heal themselves instead of going to a doctor for a penny. The reason they did all this stuff was out of devotion and their pietistic understanding that this is how I serve God, instead of saying, we have to stand up for justice because God just wants us to be about justice. No, it was sort of their means of grace.
God wants us to be compassionate.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
It was, along with God wanting us to read our Bibles and to not spit and chew or go around with those who do. God also wants us to do this stuff. It was more out of, this is what Christ has commanded us to do, so we're going to do it. Which can grow compassion in you.
Yeah, right.
And I see people do that in a lot of these churches that are so worried about piety. I know a lot of people who care a lot about the prison industrial complex and get upset about it, but I don't know many outside of my church that, out of conservative churches really that go and spend entire weekends with people in prisons. I don't know many liberal people involved in Kairos prison ministry, which is weird.
It is weird.
Maybe they're involved in prison ministry in other ways. But it appears there's even a disconnect there.
Yeah, so, I mean, you seem to have the vision
Yeah.
of that is part of your theological heritage that, I don't know, sounds powerful to me as a tool for use of difficult conversations.
Mm. The other good thing is I also have almost 3 years in these churches now, so I'm almost at the point where I feel like I can start being a little bit more open in these conversations. I'm just not there yet. For instance, another controversial issue for some reason is whether we kneel during the national anthem. And it's interesting having those conversations with people in your churches who have been in the armed forces. I'm sure you've probably had conversations here with people, maybe on both sides. But it's interesting to be able to sometimes offer pushback now with certain groups. I don't do it in front of the whole group. Like, I never would have said the word mulligan this past Sunday during the sermon, even though that's sort of what I was getting at. In smaller groups, and maybe with Rusty at another time, if he brought it up again, I might say something like that. In smaller groups, I feel more comfortable to actually have these conversations now. So there's that conversation about the kneeling. One person got in a conversation with me about what I believed about whether Jesus was the only way we could be saved. And instead of telling them what I believed directly, I said, well, there's particularism, inclusivism, and I went through all of those sort of things. I said, I think I'm kind of a soft particularist because I don't really feel like I can make that decision for God. And they were happy with it. I feel like I can have some of those conversations now. Around this particular conversation itself, it's still difficult because of everything being so up in the air. Some people are less worried about offending others than I am.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah. So would you admit or bring as part of the conversation your anxiety about, the fracturing of the church, if that's what happens?
Yeah, I think that's probably the lens I would talk more about it through, or more about my worries and fears through. I've heard church members say they would leave the church if the Methodist Church allowed gay pastors. And
I'm sure there's been one or two to slip through the cracks.
right, one or two, or yeah, sure, just that many. At the same time, it's interesting to ask them, well, can a gay person be a Sunday school teacher? Well, yeah, can a gay person be a member? Well, yeah, of course a gay person can be a member. Can they really be a full member if they're not also allowed to be a pastor? Because members are supposed to be held to the same standards as pastors in our church.
Mm.
And so that sort of gets them thinking a little bit too.
Yeah.
Although sometimes I'll say, well, I guess they can't be members then. You're right, Pastor.
Wait.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. That may not have been the directions that you wanted to give.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I hear you. Well, what would be helpful for me in this process with you? I mean, is there any more that I could be a resource for you that you haven't been using so far?
No, I feel like you've been good. Yeah, I'm fairly comfortable with where things are going right now.
Okay.
It was just one of those conversations, and I figured I'd talk about it today in light of the meeting I had to go to this weekend with the bishop, because apparently we're supposed to be talking about this stuff at our churches. And you were a good resource to talk to as somebody who's kind of been through it already a little bit.
A lot.
Yeah.
Been through it a lot. Yeah, we, I mean, before 2009, I think it's had been on the agenda of every church assembly that I'd been to for 18 years. And for a number of those years, we used to do small groups at the assembly, which is fine. But when you do it for 4 or 5 years in a row, it's like, and I kept being asked to be a small group leader. They kept asking me, and I said, after the 4th year, I said, I think I've gotten about as much as I can get out of this. But it is a process, and it's an interesting process.
Well, this is also a process we've gone through in our own conference before too.
Okay.
3 years ago, our conference actually voted to take out the incompatibility clause. It just wasn't accepted at general conference because conference broke down over the entire conversation.
Yeah.
And it's something that probably won't be moved because a number of our delegates are from Africa. Because we're a global church, it's probably something that's not going to change very quickly.
Yeah.
And that's really tough for a lot of people to hear here. But we have gone through this in Virginia. Before we even took a vote on it, because it was up for vote at the annual conference, and they said, let's take a year and talk about this. And we did it for an entire year. We had meetings for an entire year about it. And then we voted on it, and by narrow margin, we decided to suggest that they take out what we call the incompatibility clause.
Mm-hmm.
It's a great name.
It's pretty specific.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me suggest that in the few minutes that we have left, that you can present this if you want to the group. I would also ask you to maybe consider that there might be something you were a refresher.
That's why I brought it to you today.
Okay.
Because I figured I could do it today, but if I waited a whole nother week, it'd probably be a little bit old.
Well, and the other thing is that you've processed it a little bit with me.
Yeah.
So with that short circuit, the group processing it,
Yeah.
perhaps so. Although, I think the subject might be a valuable subject for the group since you're all facing it together.
And all the different congregations.
In all the different congregations, maybe it's something to
I'd
bring
say
up.
Sean's congregation is probably a little bit more open to it than Heather's, which is probably a little bit more open to it than mine.
So, I could see this as a valuable conversation for a community group time.
Yeah.
Because I imagine it's something that all three of you were having to be involved in at some level in your congregations.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
One question before I go. I
Sure.
have looked for a book to do for the book report. And I haven't found one yet. I'm trying to look for a book that would address sort of over-functioning behaviors, as that's sort of been what I've been working on the most.
Okay.
Is there anyone that really looks sort of at over-functioning instead of like the whole system, or